I think we'll start. So, hi and welcome to everyone. I'm Rob Foley from Fruition IT Resources and Consulting. Welcome to our lockdown learning series of webinars. We've been hosting a whole raft of technical discussion over the last few months. These are for the IT community to maintain engagement and learning during lockdown, and I hope everyone has been keeping well and safe. For those of you that do not know Fruition, we are a leading recruitment brand based in Leeds, Yorkshire. I've been delivering recruitment services now for the last 18 years, and we ventured into the world of technology solutions, currently building enterprise web applications for various tech companies across the UK. Today we have Chris Neiger, Program Manager at the Stars Group, who will be discussing, is technology too important to outsource? I hope not, considering our new company, but Chris has enjoyed an extensive career working internally for international companies and externally for global consultancies, giving him a unique perspective on this topic. If you have any questions during the webinar, please put them in the chat box. I will ask them to Chris at the end, and we can unmute if you'd like to ask more and have a discussion. So I think without further ado, Chris, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, that's fine. Can everyone hear me okay?
I can.
Rob can at least, so that's something good. Yeah, so as Rob said, I've sort of coming up for sort of 25 years working in technology-driven change this October. So yeah, sort of feeling my age a bit, and that started off in consultancy. I worked for sort of Accenture for about first 10 years of my career. Then I had a family and decided I didn't want to be sort of flying out of airports every Monday and getting back every Friday and spending my weekends on conference calls. And since then I've done a mixture of permanent roles and interim roles. I'm not actually a technologist by background, so my degree's in history, but I think sort of like quite a lot of people of my generation who entered the workforce in sort of the mid-90s, you know, technology was a growing area and a lot of us sort of fell into that. And I think the thing that's kept me in this field in the last sort of quarter of a century is really sort of, I'm really fascinated by the social and behavioural potential of technology and what it means for us both, you know, in terms of our business careers, but also as individuals. And I think, you know, so if you look at what's happened this year, that's been sort of in many ways the best possible illustration of that. And, you know, if you imagine if we'd had a pandemic probably as little as 10, 15 years ago, you know, when sort of technologies like what we're using today, like Zoom, like sort of, you know, sort of internet technologies, you know, sort of internet bandwidth, were very much less advanced than they are today, the kind of economic and social impact would have been even greater than it has been. So this is a topic that's always interested me. It's my own thoughts and observations. It's not representative of anyone I work for or have worked for or anything like that, but hopefully it'll be of some interest. So the background of my interest in this, I guess, like I say, when I started my career in around about 1995, one of the key concepts that businesses talked about, especially sort of consultancies where I worked for at the time, was, well, what are your core competencies as a business? What's the essence of what you do? And the sort of the flip side to that was anything that's what was called a non-core competency. You should find partners to work with to deliver that for you. And the list of things that came under this banner, still comes under this banner, was pretty extensive, really. You know, you've got HR, payroll, logistics, office cleaning, staff canteen, and IT was part of that as well. And you know, when you think about how far we've come in terms of sort of coming back from organisations and governments managing things that weren't really at the core of what they did. You know, bear in mind, if you go back to the 70s, the UK government owned hotels. So the world has changed quite a lot since then. And in terms of inclusion of IT in that list of things that were perceived to be non-core, actually back then, a lot of that made a lot of sense. IT was probably still much more focused on internal processes than sort of direct customer interactions. Bear in mind, this was probably still just about the age of the carbon copy credit card reader, and data breaches probably involved lost floppy disks rather than cyber hacking more often than not. Chances were that customers probably rarely, if ever, interacted directly with the company's IT systems. It was always through some sort of intermediary, whether that be sort of a shop assistant or sort of person in the bank branch or whatever that was. So in many ways, it was an important utility, but to what extent was it really a source of competitive advantage? And I think you saw that quite a lot as well in organizational hierarchies. Certainly in a lot of the companies I worked with back then, you might have an IT director rather than a CIO, and that person would more often than not be represented within the company's exec team. They might report into the COO or in some cases the CFO. It was quite a different environment, and so wholesale outsourcing had quite compelling cost business case for, say, especially under pressure, operations directors and finance directors. And over time, that was probably a trend that was also accelerated by the emergence of internet telecommunications, which enabled offshoring, and the increasing ubiquity of packaged software. There was a lot of things that made sense that said actually IT was something possibly at the periphery of your business, of what you did, and I think that was seen in a lot of big companies through sort of 90s and 2000s, and still today to a lot of extent. So in terms of the question I've posed about whether it's now too important to fully outsource, probably for me, the answer is yes, but it's, as ever with these things, it's nuanced. So if I talk a little bit about what I think has changed and why and how that informs my thinking on this topic, I think in summary for me, technology's tentacles have reached further and further into pretty much every business to the extent that you can't really view it as something that's at the periphery, that's not at the core of what you do, of how you interact with your customers, of how you interact with your people, as sort of how you do business, basically. And for me, one of the most interesting aspects of this, like I say, during lockdown, during pandemic, was seeing not so much how the very big companies dealt with that or struggled to deal with it, but actually how lots of smaller companies either did or did not deal with that situation. So for me, I'm a big coffee drinker. Coffee is a big part of my day. And so never mind not being able to find toilet rolls in Aldi during the start of all this, I was pretty upset to not be able to find coffee beans. So I went online, looked for coffee beans, looked for organisations and did them. And I also wanted to support smaller businesses because obviously they had less capacity to absorb the impacts of pandemic. And so what I noticed was that a lot of the smaller roasteries did not have an online ordering capability, and essentially had to go offline for about a good 3 or 4 weeks before they could put something in place to deal with that. But there were other small businesses like Pilgrim Coffee was the one I used, based up on Holy Island in the northeast, and they were absolutely there, sort of fully slick process. Website was there, online ordering, integration to all the payment mechanisms you could throw a stick at, Apple Pay, PayPal, debit card, whatever you want, and delivery within a couple of days. And like I say, for me, when you've got small business based on Holy Island off the sort of Northumbria coast that's recognised, sort of how important technology is to them in terms of how they interact with their customers, how they get customers, etc. That's when you start to think, okay, technology isn't non-core anymore. Technology is right at the core of how you do business. So that's, if you like, the background for me as sort of how I kind of think about this and why it fascinates me. And then I think that there's two aspects of that then you can sort of broaden out into. So one aspect is around, if you like, sort of people and accountability, and the other aspect is around product for me. So I'll talk a little bit first about, for me, the people element. And I guess the kind of the hypothesis here is, what's most important? Is it having the best technology, or is it having the best technologists? And to illustrate that, I'm going to tell a little story. So as well as coffee, I've also been a bit of an aviation geek all my life. And back when I thought I might end up sort of in that world for a living, rather than sort of project and program management, I read the biography of a guy called Chuck Yeager, who some of you may have heard of. He's the first guy to break the sound barrier. If you've seen the film or read the book, The Right Stuff, a lot of it is focused on him. And in his biography, he tells the story of during the Korean War, the Americans captured a Russian MiG and wanted to test fly it to understand what its capabilities were versus the American jets they had at the time. So Yeager being the sort of their top test pilot, they brought him in. They ran all the tests that they could on this, and at the end of it, one of the American pilots who'd been working with him asked, well, why haven't we tried dogfighting this Russian plane against one of our own planes? And Yeager said, well, because it's the pilot flying the plane that matters, not the plane itself. It's how much experience, how much knowledge, how much capability they've got. So his colleague said, I don't believe you. He said, okay, what we'll do is I will fly the MiG and you will fly the American plane and we'll dogfight, and then we'll swap over. And both times, regardless of the aircraft, Yeager beat his colleague in the dogfight, which was the hypothesis that it's less about the technology, it's more about the person using the technology. And I think you can argue, and from a perspective of this question about outsourcing, for me, when you're considering that question, that's not just about the actual software or the hardware, or whether you're in the cloud or on-prem, or whether you're doing buy versus build or whatever that is. It's also about how good are the internal people you've got in terms of sort of making the most of that technology. So you could have, kind of the best technology suite in the world, if you don't have somehow the people who can make the most of that, who can innovate with it, who can sort of use that to the benefit of your organization, then you're probably wasting your money. And in my career, I think there's been a few examples of where I've seen some pitfalls of that, and also some examples of where that's worked well. And obviously with these things, it is different case studies that will work differently in different businesses. So to sort of give a couple of examples of sort of pitfalls. So I worked for an organization once where they had pretty much entirely outsourced their IT capability to sort of one of the large systems integrators and communications companies, and they had retained a very small, what they called retained IT capability. And what that meant was they had a lack of personnel, a lack of bandwidth, a lack of skill sets, and even a lack of influence at exec level to effectively manage those outsourced teams and get the most from them. I've also seen a model of an organisation that had multiple centres of excellence, sort of run by different systems integrators around different aspects of their technology stack. And that certainly had a number of benefits, but it also had a number of fairly predictable downsides in terms of whenever anything went wrong, the different companies might look to their competitors as to who the blame sat with. So if you are going down a sort of a model where you're outsourcing quite significantly, you need to consider what skill sets, what internal capabilities, what structures you need to have to get the most out of that. You also, I guess, from a people aspect, need to consider how you control the people you actually have working on your account. So, you know, I've also seen examples where if the you know, sort of a account becomes worthless, how do you make sure you retain the best people from your suppliers? And I say, you know, even if you have sort of quite a lot of sort of your actual on the ground work being done by third parties, you need to make sure you do retain sufficient internal skill sets to really get the most from that. And there was an example of that for me recently in my career where two projects I did, two very similar companies in similar industries, essentially rolling out the same sort of initiative around mobile apps. One had a probably sort of largely in-house IT team, but supplemented with resource from external partners in sort of specific areas. And because they had internal IT resource who really understood not only their technology stack, but also how their business worked, they were very efficiently able to sort of meet their goals and supplement that with a sort of degree of external resource. The other company had gone the other way and had pretty much entirely outsourced their development test capability, and they struggled quite a lot more because they didn't have that really deep knowledge of how sort of the business worked and how the technology stack interacted with each other. And so, you know, in terms of sort of the people side, getting that balance right is really important. And again, for me, illustrates the point of you can't just rely on someone else to have complete ownership of your technology problems, as it were. On the product side, then, I think, you know, one of the big debates I've seen for most of my career, whenever anyone's sort of looking at new technology, there's been the question of buy versus build. Do we sort of buy an off-the-shelf software package, or do we build something ourselves? And for most of my career, the received wisdom has been, well, you're going to buy some sort of best-of-breed software and services. But certainly for me, within the last 5 years, I've seen some of that start to change. And whilst I think I'm by no means suggesting that each company should go and sort of build their own version of sort of SAP or their own video conferencing platform or their own ERP, or, you know, sort of whatever that might be. I think as technology has become more of a source of competitive advantage, more of a sort of fundamental in terms of how companies interact with their customers, it is more important to think about where are those points companies want to take more ownership of their technology stack and their ability to innovate. And I think if you look at that as an example, if you're buying an off-the-shelf software package, that's a source of competitive advantage as long as your competitors don't have it. Once you get to the point that actually everyone's got the same SAP, everyone's got the same Oracle, everyone's got the same whatever, in some ways you're more constrained, because then you're in a big stack of people asking for different types of innovation, and you're constrained by the roadmap of the company and sort of whose needs they want to service, etc. So within whatever your sort of business model is, you know, whilst you will almost certainly inevitably have those sort of off-the-shelf, sort of built software packages, solutions, services, whatever, I think it's important to also consider where are the points where you still want to be able to do something that your competitors can't or won't or don't do, without being constrained by the roadmap of a third party. And, you know, that's going to be sort of different for every business, but I think that is going to become increasingly important, and where you'll need to give consideration to your, if you like, in you know, so what are the skill sets, what are the capabilities, what are the organizational structures you will want to have direct control of, rather than sort of relying on third parties or on sort of different products, etc. And that will obviously shift over time, but I think it's something that's more important than ever to give consideration to. So those are sort of, you know, sort of probably my main areas of consideration. I think to recap, there is obviously no one size fits all solution for every business. I think there is absolutely still a place for outsourcing technical capability to a degree, whether that's either on the people side with sort of interim resources, or partnering with systems integrators, or, you know, sort of cloud models, whatever that might be. But equally, I do think we've sort of moved beyond a stage where wholesale outsourcing of your entire technology function, your entire technology capability, which was something I definitely saw in sort of the late 90s, sort of early 2000s especially, is the right way to go. And, you know, sort of I think that is something that the businesses that increasingly sort of are successful, especially in what might be a sort of post-lockdown, more remote, more sort of digital channels-based world, will have an advantage. And finally, hopefully that's been of some interest. But, you know, if you are interested more broadly in that whole concept of how does technology impact sort of a world we sort of live and work in, a couple of recommendations. So Totally Wired is a book by a guy called Andrew Smith, and he explores, if you like, some of the pioneers in the age of social media. So before there was Facebook, before there was Instagram, before there was YouTube, there was almost a bit of an experimental counterculture type thing, that was really kind of early adopters of some of that. The other one is a documentary that's available on iTunes called General Magic, and that is about some of the pioneers of mobile devices and the mobile internet. And these were guys who were working as far back as the late 80s, early 90s, trying to bring to market smartphones, which, when you consider the iPhone launched in what, 2007, 2008, they were well ahead of their time, and that was probably their downfall in some ways, in that their vision was beyond what the technology was capable of delivering at the time. But again, a really interesting insight into some of that vision. So that's that's my spin on things on that topic. Hopefully it was of some interest to people.
Thanks, Chris. That was really interesting. Thank you very much. Any questions from the attendees? If you want to just write it in the chat box. Anything for further discussion? Or you can give us a wave as well, and we can unmute you. Looks like you've blown them away, Chris.
Possibly in the sleep, one or the other.
Well, no, everyone's still here. Give it a few more moments if people are typing or not. Yeah, I think for me, Chris, it's the blended approach nowadays, isn't it? It seems. Oh, Howard, here we go. Chris, so Howard, topical question: why do you think the government dismissed the existing technologies of Google and Apple to develop a tracing app in favour of developing a solution in-house? Why not purchase the licenses from South Korea, whom only have had circa 300 deaths? That's a good question, Howard.
Yeah, that's. I'm sure that will probably come up in the inevitable after-action review that will happen once we've got past the immediate crisis phase of that. Why did they do it? I suspect there was, to some degree, frankly, probably a bit of maybe arrogance in that sort of belief in sort of British exceptionalism. I think possibly as well, that there are, they did have some legitimate objectives they were trying to achieve that weren't possible under the centralized, under the sort of model that Google and Apple were proposing. They wanted to get more information, didn't they? Sort of local health authorities, etc., which is, a legitimate goal. I think they were perhaps, though, slightly naive about the chances of convincing Apple and Google to do that, or to develop something that would do that off the shelf. I think anyone who is familiar with the history of governmental cases of trying to get those companies to sort of rescind their privacy restrictions would know that that's not typically an area governments have been particularly successful in. So yeah, I think it was probably a certain degree of hubris and a certain degree of having some legitimate goals they wanted to achieve and were over optimistic about.
Yeah, some extra from Howard then. So why do you think they didn't purchase the licenses, assuming they were available? It would have been great to see the Korean solution be adopted globally on the basis that it was just clicked off. I can't really indicate its success.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, I don't have insight into the thinking of the UK government on this.
Well, it was the NHSX, Chris. I do actually have a little bit of insight to this because I work with some healthcare consultancies that do support the NHS. And apparently, they were all blocked from working on this application. I think they were actually told that this is not going to work the way that you want it to, and that apparently you're completely right. It was arrogance. I hope nobody's on the call on the webinar from the NHS, but this is what I was told, and they didn't actually use any third parties, as far as I'm aware. They just had it all in-house, believing that they were the best of the best within that department. So yeah, that was quite interesting. I hope that answers your question, Howard. So we've got one from Dave. So Chris, does the size of a company naturally inform the tech outsourcing approach? Your coffee company example is a good one. I guess they would struggle to develop and support their own platforms. It's a really good question, that, the size of the company.
I think it comes down to sort of comes down to what they're trying to achieve, and also whether it's on that sort of people or product side. So I think a couple of interesting examples. So my wife recently, she's a midwife, works outside the NHS, and she's just recently been setting up her own website, which she did using, I'm trying to remember which product she went for in the end. But anyway, one of the many website builder products that are available, and frankly it looks a lot more professional today than similar products 10 years ago, and probably just as professional as something she got a quote for someone from about £700 for. On a more corporate level, so the organisation I was talking about, who had their own in-house IT team for development of their mobile apps, they they were not a particularly big company. I mean, you know, they were a national company, but they were that sort of mid-size of probably sort of, you know, sort of 2,000 to 3,000 employees rather than, you know, sort of one of the big banks, etc. And they chose to use a mobile applications framework called Xamarin to develop their mobile technologies. So I think it's, like I say, it's about, you know, sort of picking and choosing where you're going to be able to leverage your in-house team and your in-house knowledge for competitive advantage, whilst also recognizing there will be certain types of software and products you obviously wouldn't sort of develop yourself from scratch, if that makes sense, Dave.
That's right, Chris. So, Stephen Powell, this is an interesting one. So, Chris, I've been studying the advent of AI and machine learning and automation on the workforce. Can you see the push for automation dragging technology with it?
So I may be misunderstanding the question here slightly. Do you mean as in sort of more sort of technology almost self-managing to a certain extent? You're talking about sort of I guess AI in terms of customer service, etc. Is that the?
Oh yeah, I would take it like that.
Yeah,
push.
I think automation is something that's always going to be moving forward, and obviously sort of dependent on technology. I think we will absolutely see AI becoming more and more prevalent, especially in the customer service space. I was on a sort of one of these lockdown calls where we were talking about that fairly recently, and I think actually one of the big impacts of that could be companies moving away from offshoring to have more of that sort of work being done by AI. And for me, especially what I've seen in companies that have done offshoring for customer service successfully, they have typically done, if you like, the sort of more transactional, less complex calls offshore, whilst keeping the high value, high complexity calls onshore. Now, as AI gets more sophisticated and can do more of those types of transaction, what I think you'll see is companies doing those through AI rather than through an offshore sort of outsourcing model, if that makes sense.
Brilliant. So from Ben W, what are your thoughts on outsourcing when it comes to the balance between run and change? How good are potential customers of services at assessing their own needs?
Yeah, well, of course, there's the was it famous Steve Jobs quotes about asking customers for what they want. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he suggested that asking customers what they want isn't always the best thing. Balance between run and change. I guess it's kind of an interesting one, especially as more and more organizations move into a more product-focused model, where obviously one of the key concepts is having the team that do the sort of change and development also responsible for then running that product and sort of managing that product in live. I think for me, the outsourcing question is probably less about the division between run and change. It kind of again comes back to what are the things, as you seek to sort of get advantage over your competitors, that you want to have more direct control over, that you want to have both the ability to sort of adapt your technical products to be better than your competitors without being dependent on a third-party roadmap, but also having that deep knowledge within your technology teams of, well, how does my business work? What's important to my business? And therefore being able to sort of adapt quickly and flexibly to that.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, I think Stephen just mentioned there for the previous AI question, some clarification there, Chris. Yeah, cool. All right, has anybody got any more questions?
I think we missed one from Rob Jones.
Oh, sorry, Chris. I think it was more of a statement. So,
yeah.
yeah, he's worked for a major organisation that outsourced all of its IT about 10 years ago when I was working for them. A number of years later, they still had the third parties, but also a massive team to manage them. That is why I question outsource. That's quite a good one, actually. Yeah.
And that's, like I say, getting the balance right. I worked for an organisation that I think went too far the other way in that their team, what they call their retained IT team, was too small. But
Right.
as Robert says, you can go the other way as well, where effectively you've got double the cost base because you've got man marking going on left, right, and centre.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Any more questions from anyone? We've still got a little bit of time. If there's anything you want clearing up. Right. Well, looks like that's it. Right. Brilliant. Well, just want to say a big thank you to Chris for giving some of his time today. And we're going to put this on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. And if there's anybody that wants any further clarification, or I'm sure Chris will be able to answer questions after this as well. So I'll make sure I get an email sent to everybody with the link. But yeah, thank you very much.